Hi.
Hello there.
Good morning.
Good morning. How is everybody?
Good.
Great. How are you?
Doing okay.
Great.
I have new shoes.
Pretty spiffy.
Yeah.
Very nice.
I saw them. I had to have them. I have them now. I'm going out to dinner tonight, and so I'm going to be wearing my new shoes. There's this whole thing I do about like first wearing. You know, the first wearing has to be kind of a some sort of an occasion. So yes, we're actually going to dinner tonight like real people in the before times, which is really refreshing. So how is everybody? Does anybody have any questions or comments or anything before we get rolling?
I have a question. I emailed you about using the charmeuse for my lining.
Yes.
And you mentioned that I could block fuse it. So how do you know when it's best to block fuse it? And for something light like silk, what would you use?
Well, you know, the block fusing thing is more of a control issue. I'm not a big fan of working with charmeuse because my friend Linda Maynard really put it best. She said that I like to impose my will on the fabric. With charmeuse, you have to let the fabric do what it's going to do. And so for me, if I want to impose my will on something, I will interline it or block fuse it. That's the guiding principle. So what I would say about that is if you're comfortable working with charmeuse, it makes a wonderful lining. It feels quite nice when you slide the coat on and off. So did that answer the question?
So, yeah. So I'm going to probably try it and maybe try it without. I'm not a fan of fusible, so I don't think I want to try that first.
Okay.
Because I never have great luck with it.
Yeah. Well, I see. This is where, you know, where I wouldn't want to do it myself.
Mm-hmm.
I live in New York and I have resources where I can just bring them the fabric and say, block fuse this to a tricot or a weft or whatever I'm looking to do. What you might consider doing is using lots of paper. Cut it between paper, keep it between the paper until you sew it. That's going to help you control it. And that would be the other way of approaching it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
Thanks.
so today.
Sorry, Vivian, may I ask you a quick question? So I made my 12, but I realized that I cut the collar out in 2 pieces. I didn't see, but that's correct?
For the undercollar, yes, absolutely.
Oh, I see. So an undercollar will have a seam in the finished garment?
The undercollar will have a seam in the
Oh, okay.
The upper collar will not, because the undercollar is cut on the bias.
Yeah.
It shapes better. So yes, you have, by definition, you know, some people say, why don't you just cut the bias like this? And what you run into, because it's the twist of the yarns you're working on. If you cut it just in one piece, one collar point will wing up and the other one will not.
Oh, you said that.
It's weird, you know, it's this weird thing, but you know, and this is one of those things that I had to really ask a lot of questions, because this is something my teacher Simone taught me, is that you want them both kind of facing the same direction. And finally she said it's the twist of the yarns.
Okay.
Which, you know, you think about until you've got this weird thing going on with your collar.
So I didn't attach it. I said I've screwed up.
No, you didn't.
Okay.
No, there's a
and it has the standard seam allowance, the half inch. Okay, so I'll do that. Thanks.
Okay, so other questions before we jump into today's work? Because today what we're going to be doing, we're going to be marking and cutting, and then I'm going to show you, we're going to start a little construction. First off, I'm going to show you bound buttonholes. So because I like to show everything in the order that we're going to be doing it, because I had this question, it was in another class, but it was order of construction. And so the bound buttonholes go in, you know, you have your fronts cut, you have all your marking done. The bound buttonholes go in pretty much at the beginning. It's sort of counterintuitive because when you are working with worked buttonholes, that really happens at the end. So these are the three videos that we're going to be doing today. So let's see, admit.
Hi, Kenneth. I have one question before we get started.
Yes, ma'am.
What size buttons are we using on this coat?
You could use a 1-inch button.
1-inch button, okay.
And so, you know, I'm glad you asked that because see, this is one of those questions that comes up, and it's, you know, I like to have kind of general rules for different things, and this is something I learned from my teacher Simone. The overlap is determined by the button diameter. And so in this particular coat, the overlap is 1 1/8 inches. And so the overlap is the button diameter plus 1/8 of an inch. And so if you wanted to have a larger button, one thing you would want to do is have more overlap between the center front and the finished edge of the garment.
Got
So
it.
this is a 1-inch button.
Okay, perfect.
And
Thank
also
you.
the other thing is the length of the buttonhole is the button diameter plus 1/8 of an inch. So those are
Okay.
just some good general rules, you know, when you're working on things that you can kind of just know that these will work. Because that extra 1/8 of an inch, people ask me what's that for? That's the turn of cloth. If you just had the distance between the center front and the edge as the overlap, 1 inch as the diameter of your button, what's going to happen is that with the turn of cloth, because you have that seam on the front of the garment, the button is going to look like it's sitting a little bit too close to the edge,
Okay,
like it's falling off. So that's that 1/8 of an inch is sort of a fool the eye trick. You know, there are certain things that people like, for example, in architecture. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Gattaca, but Gattaca is filmed at the Marin Civic Center in Marin, California. And the building was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. And it's this long building, looks very Jetsons, but it has this row of, he wanted to create a completely horizontal top line on this building. And so to achieve that, because it's not really achievable in architecture, there are gold spheres mounted all along this line, and all of the gold spheres are adjusted so that they hit dead parallel with the horizon. And so it fools the eye that you think that that is a completely straight line when it really isn't. So there are certain things you do in architecture, in clothing, to fool the eye into certain things. And so the extra 1/8 of an inch is one of those sorts of things.
okay.
Okay. Another little kind of aside before we get into the thing. I don't know how many here watch Marlene Dietrich movies, but I do. And she had a crooked nose, and a lot of people didn't really know this. What they would do is they had a paintbrush that had like 3 hairs in it, and they would paint a fine metallic silver line down the center of her nose and then powder over it.
Oh,
So that if you look at photos, you'll just see this little reflection, and it creates the illusion that her nose is straight.
oh, okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Fun with fashion. Okay, so
Could I just ask a quick question, please, about the front pattern piece?
yes.
What's the stepped bit at the bottom?
Okay, well, part of that is the facing is going to extend a little past the okay, actually hold the pattern up so everyone can see it. The bottom. Okay, if you see where it jogs down from, because your seam allowance is 1/2 inch up to a certain point, and then the seam allowance is the hem allowance, which is 1.5 inches. So if you were to draw a seam, if you were to draw a line from 1.5 inches, 5, it's the entire finished edge is going to be straight, but that little extra width that you have on the hem allowance, you've got your facing and you've got your hem allowance. You want the hem allowance. You don't want the hem allowance to go all the way over to the finished edge. You just want the hem allowance to stop just a little bit inside the vertical edge of your facing. And that's why you have that little jog there, is that it's just.
So are you saying that this shorter bit here is actually the lining or something,
No,
whereas this would be the main
no,
fabric?
you see, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be sewing the facing to the body.
Right.
And so the facing is going to extend a little bit, you know, you've got the jog down here. The facing is going to extend a little past that jog so that when you turn it right side out, the jog falls between the layers of fabric.
Okay. Well, I'm sure
You know, this
I'll
is
just follow every
it's
step.
like,
but
trust me, when you get there, it'll make
I
perfect.
will. I will
Yeah.
trust you.
Okay. Okay.
And
So
the pattern is an awesome pattern, and the fit is actually perfect. The way it fits, you know, the body, the upper body, and then it flares out. I love the pattern.
well, I'm glad you do. You know, I made it to fit me. I know that sounds crazy, but you know,
Yes. I
Anyway.
just need some more wearing ease in it.
well,
That's
it's
all.
easy enough to do. Yes. Okay. So let us get started. So the first one is going to be the cutting and marking, which is, come on, there we are. Cuff latch, cutting and marking. Okay. And so let's see, cuff latch, cutting and marking. Here we are. And let's see, admit this over here. So everyone can see, right?
The screen is blank.
Can you see?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, good. Okay. So I will block that down. Okay, here we go. Cutting out the lining is fairly straightforward, and I generally like to cut the lining out first. What you have here is the center back piece and the front. You can see I'm cutting it out of a rather busy paisley. Now I'm using this rather busy paisley so I don't have to worry about matching a pattern, because matching a pattern on a raglan sleeve is a bit of a challenge. So I will cut these two pieces here, then lay out the sleeve and cut that. And now you can see I have the sleeve linings laid out. I will go off camera and cut those out, and you'll get to see the results. Now, before I continue, I would like to talk a moment about the cutting tools. I have the rotary cutter. I also have my Ginker shears. I like to spread my cutting out between the two. I don't use the shears or the rotary cutter exclusively. This way, I feel that you can avoid any repetitive stress injuries in your sewing. I think this is a really good consideration at this point. So be kind to your hands. Have multiple ways of cutting. This is the lining for the cuff latch. Now on the cuff latch, you either cut it along the grain or you cut it across the grain. That is up to you. I'll talk about that when we cut the one in base fabric. But I like to cut the lining on the bias. I find it's far easier to turn this right side out when you cut the lining on the bias. And this is the pocket bag. You could cut it out of the lining fabric. You could cut it out of pocketing. But we cut two of these because front and back, the way we set the welt pockets, this will create one whole pocket. So the straight grain is right here. And I will cut this out with my rotary cutter. Now on to marking. The first thing I want to mark is the shoulder dart on the lining sleeve. Pretty straightforward thing to do. Just use your tracing carbon and tracing wheel. Now, debates rage about using the tracing carbon. Some people try to slip it between the layers, have the right sides out. I like the right sides together, so it's far easier to have one laying on the table facing up. Then you have the two layers of fabric. Was there a question?
It's all clear.
Okay. You have the carbon facing down, and then the pattern on top. That is the easy way to go. Now, another little marking thing here. This is what's called a dual tracing wheel. It's metric. We're not going to be using it for this, but they adjust, as you can see. You can adjust the widths, and then you put one finger here, one finger here. So you can have one tracing wheel on the stitching line, and then the other one will make the cutting line. Now, if you want to use one, don't just take this off and set it aside, because it will end up in the trash and you don't want to lose it. I just turn them like so. Now, my students, sometimes when they're shipped like this. So the students ask, okay, what's up with that? And I have to tell them, okay, you take them out and you turn them. So yes, now I like the ones with the blunt ribs as opposed to the needles. Doesn't damage the fabric so much. Okay. Shoulder, this is where we just come in with the scissors and make any snips that we need to make. Seam allowances, and that's marking the sleeve. The only thing really to mark on the front is snips at the armhole. You can also mark a snip on the side to match it up. And I just will make a snip here where I fold it, so you can match this up to the back. The front is ready to go. Here is the lining back. So make one snip at the center back. We make two snips. As a rule, two snips are on the back, one snip is on the front. One mark here, and one mark here.
Kenneth, a
Yeah.
question.
Yes, what's the question?
I noticed that you're cutting out on the cutting line that you're all that we have. We're trusting our fit on our muslin
Yes, that's
and
correct.
transferring the lines back to the pattern.
That's
And so all we have to adjust is a 1/2 inch.
What do you mean all we have to adjust is a 1/2 inch?
When we assemble the coat itself,
Yes,
if we have to let out, all we have is say at best 3/4 of an inch.
Okay, so I guess I'm not understanding your question.
I just want to make sure that it's that the point I guess I need to make sure of is that it's very critical, the fit of the muslin.
Absolutely, yes. Because once you get the muslin fitted, you want to make sure that you have your 1/2 inch seam allowances. You know, all of the adjustments incorporate the 1/2 inch seam allowances, because we're assuming from this point forward that the pattern itself has been corrected and fitted, and now we're going into construction.
Why are we not using the muslin itself as the pattern?
That's a couture sort of conceit, and see, okay, because Susan Calgi uses the muslin as the pattern, and I think has a lot of value for a one-off if you're doing just one of these. But my training is flat pattern, so what I like to do is I always like to take all of the alterations back to the paper, because in my way of working, it's a lot more solid. And generally also, like what we did last week, some of you that I've talked to in office hour have had to do some major adjustments. And so once you do major adjustments to generate all the pieces, the facings, the linings, all of that, in flat pattern, that is just formula. It's a lot easier. So I have found for the kinds of things that I've had to make through my career, and a lot of times when I'm teaching classes, most people want the corrections taken back to the paper so that it's a little more solid.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so other questions? Okay, back to the story. Next, the pocket. We just want to know where this fold line is on the pocket. So it's a simple matter of 2 steps. Fairly easy. And the lining on the cuff latch, don't really need any marks. That will take care of itself. So we have all of the marking, cutting done for the lining. Next will be the face fabric. This is the fabric that I'm going to be using for the demonstrator coat. This is a boucle. As you can see, it has a little metallic in it.
Okay.
So it's kind of pretty. But what you notice is that I have block fused it on the back. Now, this is not absolutely necessary, but what I wanted to do is to block fuse it so that you could tell the right side from the wrong side during the videos. So what I have done here is I have laid everything out. This is a 3.5 yards of fabric at 54 inches wide. You notice I've got a little bit left over, which is better, just in case you have a boo-boo.
Kenneth, may I ask a
So,
question?
yes. Unfold.
It's Vivian Keegan.
Yes.
On the pattern piece that's on the table right now, there are some lines at the top of the pattern piece. What are they?
Okay. Oh, hang on. The lines on.
Keep going.
There we are.
Right
Yes.
there.
Hang on.
Yeah, here.
Yeah. Okay. Those are just guidelines. That's when I was drafting the pattern. And last week when I talked about generating the pattern pieces, if you've had to do a lot of corrections, this is where the facing would fall on this particular piece. You don't really need to transfer these lines to your main fabric.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
Okay. Other questions? Okay. So what I have done here is I have laid everything out. This is a 3.5 yards of fabric at 54 inches wide. You notice I've got a little bit left over, which is better, just in case you have a boo-boo. So let me unfold this and I'll show you the layout. What you see here, there's one of the sleeves, there's the other sleeve. This is the back. I'm orienting everything in one direction. This fabric, I'm not really sure whether it has a nap or not, but I've decided to orient everything in the same direction just so that there is no change of the surface texture when the garment is being worn. This is what's called a nap layout. The other option would be what's called a nested layout, where you turn all the pieces so that you can get a higher yield. That works for solid fabrics and tweeds and such, but for this particular fabric, I've decided to go with a nap layout. And here are the rest of the pieces. You have the under collar piece cut on the bias. You have the upper collar cut center back on fold. This is body front. This is the facing for the front. And then down here, I'm actually going to turn this. This is going to be the back neck facing. So these are the pieces that you cut from your face fabric. I will cut these out and then we will cover some marking. And one final piece. This is the cuff latch, and if you remember, we cut it on the bias in the lining. The straight of grain here, you could run it straight of grain, but I've decided to run it cross grain so that when it lays onto the sleeve, the texture will be the same. From here, we have our pieces of the face fabric. Next, we want to cut the tailoring canvas and the muslin. And finally, we
Can I
cut.
ask a question?
Yes,
With the cuff latch, my fabric is napped.
yes.
Which is the top of the cuff latch, the longer part of the point or the
Yeah,
shorter part of the
Yeah,
point?
this part right here, that faces up. So it narrows down as you get towards the cuff.
Okay, So the longer point is at the top.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So other questions? Okay. Collar out of a thin muslin and out of the tailoring canvas.
Okay.
I will-
I'm sorry, is that the upper collar?
No, this is, hang on.
I'm sorry?
This is the
Here's the
undercollar.
undercollar.
Okay,
Undercollar.
under collar.
Yeah, the undercollar it's cut out of muslin, it's cut out of the tailoring canvas, and it's also cut out of the face fabric.
Okay.
Okay. We have the undercollar cut from the face fabric, the muslin, and now, as you can see, save this out with the pocket belt guide. You don't have to cut this out just yet. Keep these two together because you will need.
Kenneth, I have a question
Yes.
and a comment. Somebody is not muted, so I'm not hearing you at some points.
Okay.
So that under collar
Yes.
is cut out of the muslin and the tailoring canvas?
Yes. As well as the face fabric. So there are three different.
Okay.
Yes. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so yeah, everyone make sure you're muted unless you have a question so that everyone can hear. So all of our cutting is done. So to recap what we have done, we've cut out the lining pieces from the lining fabric. We've cut out the face fabric pieces from the face fabric. We've also cut the undercollar from muslin and tailoring canvas, and we've saved out the welt guide with the tailoring canvas. So we have all of our pieces cut, ready for marking.
Could you roll that one more time, please?
Sure. To cut this out just yet, but keep these two together because you will need those later. All of our cutting is done. So to recap what we have done, we've cut out the lining pieces from the lining fabric. We've cut out the face fabric pieces from the face fabric. We've also cut the undercollar from muslin and tailoring canvas. And we've saved out the welt guide with the tailoring canvas. So we have all of our pieces cut, ready for marking.
Hey,
Now
Kenneth,
we have everything.
I have a question. As far as that welt guide is concerned,
Yes.
this is for the welt pocket. Are we going to do that, our own pattern for the welt
Well, no,
pocket?
actually, well, the welt pocket is going to be 2 lessons because it's kind of a deep dive. The first lesson is going to be how you generate the pattern piece for this particular welt and how you kind of set up the welt and the pocket. Then the next lesson is going to be how you sew it into the coat. And so this is a variation of an article I wrote for Threads magazine a while ago called the origami welt pocket. And so, you know, and I teach this to my students at FIT. It's good to understand the pattern making because if you understand the pattern making, it is going to serve you well, not just in this particular instance, but anywhere where you're making a single welt pocket. So that's why we don't cut out any welt pieces at this point. We'll be doing the cutting on that when we get to that particular lesson.
Okay, so it's going to be the same pattern piece as we did in the other class for the single welt pocket, or
we're going to create it in the same way.
Okay.
In that particular single welt pocket. For those who are wondering what class this was, it was a class I taught on pattern review on single welt pocket. This is that construction. It's a little different because you have the pocket on an angle as opposed to sitting horizontally.
Got it.
But yeah, so that's what we're going to be doing.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so other questions? Okay then, so out aside from marking clips on the notches, there are a couple things that I want to mark. Pocket placement and also center front and the button placement. Now, a little note here. What I've done, I've worked ahead, and since I altered this here, I needed to redistribute the spacing for the buttons. So that's what I would say is don't forget to do that. You could actually just wait until you have the buttonholes made. You know, it's just good to look at it in the pattern. I like everything back to the pattern as best I can. So the first thing I want to do is make tailor tacks. Now, some people sew through the paper. I don't encourage that. So what you can see here, punched actually holes. And I've used the eyelet punch from my buttonhole chisel. So I have a nice round hole. And I'm going to show you how I like to mark tailor tacks, which is maybe the same as you do it, maybe a little different, but I'd like to cover it here. This one at the edge because it's just a little easier to access for the video. What I want to do, I'm using, it's a Gutermann thread, Gutermann, Mara 30. I like that because it has a little bit of heft to it. You can use really whatever basting thread you choose. I like a double strand. So then I'm going to stitch down and then up right next to it. And then a little spacer. I find this makes it a little easier to make the loops consistent. Stitch in, you bring the needle back out. Notice we're not going through the paper, we're just going through the little hole. It's a little easier if I'm not looking through the camera. There we are. And stitch it back in. I'll show you how this works. So I have that out. So then see, the nice thing is you can get this, you don't have to worry about tearing up your pattern. And ultimately, when you separate the fabric later, come in here, cut the threads. There you have your tailor tacks. So now I will work ahead and mark all of the buttonholes and matching notches for the welt pocket and bring it back here because next we want to mark the center front line. All of the tailor tacks in. The next thing that we want to do is mark the center front. Now some people stitch through
With the, may I ask a question?
Sure, yes.
With the buttonholes, are you marking just the center of the buttonholes on the center line, or are you marking each end, or just one end, or?
You want to mark one end.
Okay,
The end closer to the edge is generally how I mark it.
okay.
Okay?
Thank you.
This is a fairly easy thing to do. We're going to fold the paper on the center front. Then I'm going to show you it's a variation of thread tracing. So with the thread tracing, we're going to be using the same Mara 30. And I'm going to start a little above this buttonhole here. And the easiest way to to remember it is you stitch twice, you leave a loop. As we go along the cut edge of the paper, we make a stitch that lays flat. And a loop. Next, flat, and a loop. There's a different way I'll show you in a moment, but this is essentially what we're doing. One stitch is flat, one stitch creates the loop. This is what it looks like. You have flat, loop, flat, loop, flat, loop. Now, there's another way if you're feeling very frisky and adventurous. You can get 2 stitches in one pass. So this, we have the loop here, flat. So now, the thread is flat. Now this, watch very carefully. Take 1 stitch and another stitch. Where having a long needle is going to be helpful. And then you leave the loop. So you have a loop and a flat all in one. So let's just do that again. 1 stitch. Another stitch. So it creates the same thing. So you can choose to do it the first way, which is a loop and a flat stitch, which is a little easier to remember. Or you could do it, you have your flat stitch here, 1 stitch which is going to create the loop, and the next stitch which is going to create the flat stitch. 2 different ways of making the thread tracing. Now, I'm going to zoom out a little bit so you can see. So here you have a loop and a flat stitch. I will continue off camera and finish the rest of this and bring it back to show you the results. So here we are. We have all of the thread tracing sewn. Now I'm going to show you how this works. It's kind of like magic. Pry the fabric apart and cut down the center. This is a little memory trick if you're working on a fabric that the front and the back side look the same. I have this view so you can tell back from front, but some fabrics is a little bit unclear. How I remember this, the face has the whiskers. So if you have a fabric where you can't tell front from back, you look for the whiskers. On the back, it's going to look like this on one side, it will look like this on the other side, but there's no whiskers. And that's how I remember the face has the whiskers. I will go and open the rest of this and bring it back and show you the result. So we have all of our marking done. And when I put the pockets in, I will open up tailor tacks on the pocket. So we have our cutting. We have our marking done. Now we get to start construction. But before we start construction, I would like to recap marking. On the lining, aside from making the snips for the matching notches in the seam allowances, really the only marking we want to do is the shoulder dart on the sleeve. On the main garment, you want to have tailor tacks for the buttonholes, tailor tacks for the pocket placement, and thread tracing for the center fronts. Make sure not to stint on marking. It will make your life so much easier later. So now, let's start making this coat.
May I ask one more question?
Yes,
I would do a tailor's tack at the dart tip too, right?
yes, that's a good idea.
Okay. And then just snip the side notches.
Yes.
Okay.
Or you could do little tailor tacks at where the legs hit the seam allowance.
Okay.
Okay.
Kenneth, one more question for me. On the center front, what's the 24.5-inch indicator? You have it written out.
You know, that I'd have to. Is it something that's on your pattern, or it was just on mine?
No, it was on the pattern. I think it's on there. See it right above the pocket says 24.5. Right, or am I not? Yeah.
4.5. I think that is this, you know, I don't know what that is. I must confess. I'd have to go back and look at the pattern. So what I would say is, you know, if I didn't call it out here, don't sweat it.
Okay. I just didn't know if it was something like the actual measurement or something we needed to, use as a reference.
No, sadly, I honestly can't remember what that was for.
Okay, not a problem.
Okay, so I'm going to stop here. And so questions, comments at this point? Are you glazing over yet? Okay, good. Because next we're going to talk about the bound buttonholes. Okay, so let us continue. Cuff latch, bound buttonholes. Okay. And that we can put away. Cuff latch, bound buttonholes. Ah, there we are. Yeah. Okay. The double welt pocket and the bound buttonhole strike fear into a lot of people. I used to be one of them until I figured out this particular technique. What we have here is a 1/2 inch opening. This is our double welt pocket. As you can see, it has what's called a facing, and then there's the pocket bag. And from here, looking down, we have the bound buttonhole and how it finishes to a facing. So these, I know, look a little scary and intimidating, and I was where you are now. So we are going to learn how to make the double welt pocket and the bound buttonhole. Actually, we're just going to do the bound buttonhole. I have excerpted this from a longer lesson, which is the double welt pocket and the bound buttonhole, just so you know. Got a lot of work to do, so let's get busy. Before I continue, I thought it's good to show you where we're going with this so you can see what we're doing. We are creating what I call the welt unit. These two folded edges will eventually meet in the final pocket. This is the front with 1 row of stitching. This is the back with 3 rows of stitching. This will become important later. But right now, let's make the welt units. To begin, we want a woven edge ribbon. Now, how you can tell a woven edge ribbon is it looks like it has a little selvage on each edge. There is another ribbon called Petersham. It does not look like this. You want the ribbon to look like this. Now, the size is very important. As you can see here. 7/8 inch, 22 millimeter. This is white polyester grosgrain ribbon. You can use any color. I'm choosing to use white so that we can see what we're doing here. But this particular ribbon for this particular operation is essential, except no substitutes. Because ultimately, we're going to be making a 1/2 inch wide finished opening. So what we're seeing here, I have cut a strip of the fabric 3 times wider than the ribbon. So roughly 3 inches. You can go a little over. Doesn't really matter. You can trim it away later. So now this, we're going to lay this down onto the reverse of the fabric. Wrong side of the fabric facing up. So it doesn't hurt to just come in here and pin a few pieces in place. So we're pinning this in place. So next, we will go to the sewing machine. From here, we will edge stitch this ribbon to about 1/8 of an inch in. Once we've sewn one side, we go back to the beginning and sew the opposite side. You don't want to sew down one way and up the other way because you're going to get a twist. Direction is going to make it so that everything lies flat. Done. Let me pull out a little bit, show you where we're at. So here we have the ribbon sewn to the reverse of the fabric. Turn it over, you will see these stitches. Ultimately, these stitches will end up on the inside. You won't see these in the final product. Next, we go to the pressing table. First, press as sewn. Then our next step is going to be, see, ultimately, we're going to press both of these sides up over the ribbon. But instead of bringing this up like so, it's far easier when you're pressing. You're going to use the ribbon. You're going to fold it on the ribbon and push slightly. By doing that, you wrap the fabric securely over the edge of the ribbon. You're not folding it on the stitching line. You just want the fabric to crease up and over the edge of the ribbon. So let me show you the result here. So that is this side. So we folded up and over the ribbon, but you notice we didn't fold the ribbon. Important. Now, our next step will be back at the machine where we will machine base through all the layers midway between these 2 rows of stitching. So you want to sew with a long machine base, 5.0 stitch. And this goes midway between these 2 rows of stitching. Now, if it isn't dead in the middle all the way perfectly, that's not going to kill it. You just want to sew it as accurately as you can. Let me show you the results. what it will look like from this side. That's what it will look like from this side. Next, trimming. So here we are. I've flipped it over. So when you're trimming, a little tip for trimming, slide the blade along this way. Have the raw edges facing your palm and slide the blade this way. It goes very quickly. What you'll see is that you can get fairly close. So you're going to trim all of this seam allowance off. Almost done. Okay. So we have, and that is a little raggy there, don't sweat. That's in the seam allowance. You'll never see that in the finished piece. So we are halfway there. Back to the pressing table. Again, we press from the back, and again, we want to press over like so. So we have this. We'll go back to the machine. So one more time down that row of stitching. And as we sewed last time, same 5.0 stitch length. Green line of stitching. Once we have that, turn this a little bit this way. Here we are. And that is what it looks like. And again, we will trim this side as well, close to the stitching. And once we have this trimmed, I'll give it one more press and meet you back at the work table. There you are. I will press, and as I said, meet you back at the work table. This is the result. So now we have what I call the welt unit, because where we're going with this is we have two folded edges, and then ultimately we will split this down the middle, but not yet. Having both welts sewn as one unit makes everything easier to manage. And also, just as a memory aid, if you see these 3 rows of stitching, that's the wrong side. But I'm not going to say wrong side, right side. I'm going to say 3 rows of stitching, 1 row of stitching. So you can tell the two apart. Now that we have the welt unit, we can start the buttonhole. Make sure you have about 1 inch on either end. It's just easier. You can always trim it off later if you don't need it. These marks should be perpendicular to the folded edges. Now again, let me just cut this off and I'll point it out. Notice you mark it on the side that has the 3 rows of stitching. This is the face of the fabric. This is what you'll see facing up when you put them together. And that's how you determine the length. from here, we want to mark the stitching line. So I can put this aside. So I will.
Kenneth, I have a quick question.
Yes.
I think I misheard earlier. So the 3 rows is the face side and the 1 row is the back side?
Actually, don't really think about face and back.
Okay.
You know, moving forward, what we want to do is we want to see the 3 rows, because if we have the 3 rows facing up when we put this unit, whether it's a buttonhole or pocket, to the front of the fabric, everything will turn out right. Because the mistake some people make is having just the side with 1 row of stitching facing up, and then when you install the welt, you're going to see these edge stitches. So I've learned over the years to just say 3 row stitching facing up is the way you go in this particular situation. Did that help?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, good. Okay. This one first. Now what you're looking at, you want the edge to be, see, there's 1/4 of an inch, there's 3/8 of an inch. You want the fold to be ever so slightly past the 1/4 of an inch mark on your ruler. Over here. Better. Yes. Okay. So I'm going to zoom in here, move this over a little. So you can see it's just a hair past that 1/4 of an inch. Now, this is the rule. It's better to have it too close to the middle than too close to the edge, because this is going to be the width of our welt. And if you have it too close to the edge, you're going to get a gap between the 2 welts when they're finished. Now, for positioning, these 2 intersection points here represent the intersection of the cross marks and this row of stitching down the middle of the welt unit. So when you're placing it, you can check placement by seeing where that stitch is.
And if I have a question.
Yes. Pin, or you could just.
When we marked our coat front, we only did 1 tailor tack. So
Right.
You're going to come back and tell us how to do this marking on the coat front?
Well, really, if you just think about it for just a moment, let me run this back just a teeny bit. Let's just say that because in this particular sample, this is going to be the finished edge. So the tailor tack would be right there.
Mm-hmm.
And then you would just mark your chalk perpendicular and mark your other, your other length line there.
And that distance between those is 1 1/8 inches, you said?
Yes, the diameter of the button plus 1/8 of an inch.
Okay.
Okay.
May I ask one question?
Yeah, please do.
The marking on the coat front, is that on
This is on the front side of the fabric.
the facing, like the good side?
The good side, yeah. And so what I use a disappearing chalk.
Yep, I have some of yours. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, that really has saved my bacon over the years. And a little marking thing, what I try to do, and I encourage my students at FIT to do this, is try not to mark with colored chalk if you can avoid it, because especially on whites, grays, pastel colors, you're never going to get the marks out completely. So if you mark with the white chalk, you have a fighting chance of getting the marks out. If you mark with the disappearing chalk, you just hit it with a little steam and it just disappears.
Can you thread trace that if you wanted to?
You could, but I just find it's a little easier to have the use a chalk mark. I mean, you could thread trace it, but what I would do is I would go over it with the chalk and then remove the thread tracing before I installed the buttonholes. But you could do that.
This is Vivian. The buttonholes are vertical to the center.
No, ma'am. They're perpendicular.
Okay.
Yeah, because buttonholes parallel to the center, that's more for shirts. But for coats and such, it's customary that the buttonholes are perpendicular to center.
Got you.
Okay.
So oh, sorry, Kenneth, one quick question. So the horizontal line on the pattern could be the bottom of it, correct? Could be the start of the buttonhole?
That, well, the horizontal line, you know, if you're making this line here, this represents where the two welts will meet.
Okay.
And so, you know, I mean, that point there represents that point there. And so when you sew these two rows of stitching and you cut it open and you turn it, the two folded edges will meet right on this line here.
Okay.
You with me?
I think so.
Okay. So
I have-
let's, yeah, go
I
ahead.
have a question.
Yeah.
If we're using block fused fabric, should we use the fused piece to make the welts, or should we reserve some without fusing to
You know,
make
you
the
could do it
welts?
either way. I would probably use some that doesn't have the fusing on it to make the welt.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
That's actually a very good question. Okay, so other questions? Okay, then we will continue. So when you're placing it, you can check placement by seeing where that stitch is. And I'm going to pin. You could pin, or you could just thread this. Doesn't matter. So we pin this in place. Next, we go over to the machine. So now we're going to put the needle down right there. And so I'm going to put the needle in. There we are, right there. And then you can lower the presser foot, take out one of the pins. Now the stitch length here is 0.75. Short stitch. This is a buttonhole. You're going to be opening and putting buttons through it. You want it to be strong. And so now we're going to sew. Here, this is, notice I haven't trimmed this end here. You don't want to trim this end. What you want to do is you want to pull this across to make sure that you know exactly where to put your needle in. You have that in. And then here, bring this across. So you want to make sure these rows of stitches end in the same place. Now, if you have to raise up the presser foot, there we are, a time or two to make sure that that's all good. The results there is the result. Now, back to the work table to open this up. And you can see I've trimmed all the threads here. So what I want to do first is we'll use scissors, and we're going to open this up. We're going to split this in half. We don't want to cut through the ground fabric. We just want to cut the welt unit in half. As you can see now, we have two different welts. Now let's turn this over. So now you can see here that both of these rows of stitches end in the same place. They should be the same length. If not, you can pick 2 or 3 stitches out to make sure that they do end up the same place. Now what we will be doing doesn't hurt to draw it just because then you have the reference. We're going to be cutting from here to there, to there, to here, to here. And then we'll turn everything right side out. But what I want to do is take this over to the pressing table.
Can you run the cut here to here to here to here again?
Okay, so if you just took, if you just took a ruler and connected this line to here and this line to here, it would make, it's kind of an elongated X. And what I just like to do is I like to start in the middle and cut to each end separately. It's much easier than trying to start right at the end of the stitching and cut backwards. So you're going to start in the middle and cut outwards to the end of each of these rows of stitching. Does that make sense?
It does, yes, thank you.
Okay.
Another question.
Yes.
You have fusible interfacing on this particular piece of sample.
Yes.
Are we going to do something similar to our coat front?
Yes. If you're going, when we put the welt pockets in, I will have some fusible behind this too. If you want to make bound buttonholes, I would recommend some fusible. It just really simplifies things. Okay.
I have a question before
Yeah.
we move on. With the bouclés, do you recommend the bound buttonholes, or is that going to be really hard?
Well, see, that's the one thing with the boucle. And I think it's another reason I did block fuse this, just to kind of head off this problem. If you're working on something like a lint and tweed that has a bit of a loose weave, and if you cut into it, it unravels. First off, I would block fuse it because it's going to make it easier to control, but then I would still even use some fusible behind that for your welt pockets or the bound buttonholes. Now, as far as a bound buttonhole rather than a worked buttonhole, I think in a boucle, a bound buttonhole is much prettier. It has a little more heft, and also over the life of the garment, I think it's going to last longer.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So the clipping goes like so. I'm going to start this, and you're going to clip just the ground fabric right to the end. And do this with all four. This is all very, very ticklish and careful. Now, the problem that some people create is they don't cut right to the end of the stitching. They stop about 1 millimeter before. That just makes a pucker. So you've used very short stitches for this. So it should hold true. Now we want to turn everything right side out. So I'm going to turn this over, and this is how I remember it. If you use this method, your seam allowances, the little triangles on the end, will end up where you want them. So we're going to put the folded edges together, and you're going to feed the raw cut edges through the opening. And if you feed them through the opening, it's going to start looking like a bound buttonhole, because that little triangle is going to line up where you want it to. You want that to be there. And so let's do that on this side here again. Line up the folded edges, feed this through to the back. And so far, not bad. So now what I like to do, I'll go in and trim that out later, is to press this on the seam roll. I'm going to turn this over. And see, when you turn this over, one thing you can do is you can look and make sure that both of those cross marks match. Because if they match, you're all good. that means that you won't skew the rectangle. And you can come in here with thread and just base these closed. This will just make your life easier. You'll take this out later, so use a contrasting thread. So here we have this stitch closed now. And we can come in, and like I said, I like pressing over the seam roll so that we don't emboss the seam allowances into the surrounding fabric. So here it's pressed. So now let's have a look here. Beautiful. So I can take that out later. So our next step is going to be at the sewing machine. Our next step is to sew the little triangles down. Now, this turned out pretty well. Sometimes you get an overlap of the two welts. And so you notice here, let's look at this foot. This is the zipper foot. You could use any zipper foot. I like the adjustable zipper foot. We're going to sew the little triangles at the ends down. So we fold this back. Here we are. We're going to sew right across there. So we bring this under the foot. It's good to keep the threads out of the way. Zoom in a little bit here. So the object here is to get right up next to that fold. You're going to sew this with a 0.5 stitch. So before you sew, I like to put one finger here. You can pull one down, pull one up, and then put this right next to the fold. And then you're going to sew. Like so. So again, there you have the stitch, and there you have the bound buttonhole. Now, what I will do, I turn this over, you can trim these threads away. And you can also trim these ends to about 1/4 inch. You don't have to have a lot hanging out in the final garment, but you do want to remove this like so. Having the long ends, it just makes everything easier to manipulate as you're sewing. But there you have a bound buttonhole. Now, finishing the buttonhole. What I've done here is I've sewn a mock facing for this buttonhole because the object here, when you make a bound buttonhole, is that you actually want it to work. Now, in the old days, what they would do is they would just cut a slash and whip stitch the facing to the back of the buttonhole. It never worked. It never looked good. So I'm going to show you how I like to do it because I think it gives a better finish. So to begin,
Kenneth, I have a quick question.
yes, have the facing on, don't
So we would be folding the facing will be attached to the jacket and we're going to be folding that back for this
Yes,
piece?
that's correct. And so what when I'm finishing buttonholes, I will sew the facing on, make sure the facing, when it presses back into position, make sure the facing is completely installed and you're happy with the placement. And then you're going to do the step that we're seeing here. Because, you know, there's some people who say, well, if you mark it correctly, you can mark the openings on the facing and they'll line up with the buttonholes. They never do. So yeah, so what we're doing here, I have a seam right here. So this is sort of a mock facing, but the finishing the backs of the buttonholes really comes more towards the end. Okay. Okay, so let us finish this buttonhole. Just finish the openings and then put the facing on. You want the facing sewn in place before you even try this. And if you need to, you can baste all of this down to make sure you know where your placement is. Then turn this over. And there's the buttonhole. Where the buttonhole is, we're going to place silk organza. You could use polyester organza if you wish. I like silk better. It presses better. Or you could use cotton organdy, something thin. Operative word.
This on the good side of the facing, Kenneth?
Yeah, this is on the right side of the fabric.
Okay.
Our next step then is to turn this back over. We want to put one pin there and one pin here. Now, another way you could do this is you could put 4 pins there and make a square opening. I like an oval opening. So you want to know the beginning and the end of that opening. Turn this back over. Dot there. Dot there. So those are the 2 marks that we need to hit. Now, eighth of an inch below, eighth of an inch above. So you have these 2 parallel lines, and then you want to make an oval as even as you can, obviously. Like so. That actually should be right about there.
And you go through those end marks?
Yes, you want to bring that around like so. Okay?
Yes.
It's good to come back in here, unpin this. That's done its job. Make sure the organza is pinned securely. We're ready for the next step, which will be at the sewing machine. So here we have the silk organza. Now we're going to open out this flat because we're going to use what's called a free motion stitch. We drop the feed, we put on a darning foot, and there we are. That goes right there. Down. And this is hand guided. The machine is not feeding. You feed it with your fingers. So you can move it slowly. slowly, you make an extremely short stitch. So what we're creating here, when this is all said and done, is a faced opening, a long opening. Just a little something to know. Threads, and then I'll talk about this.
Kenneth, this is Vivian. May I ask a question?
Yes, please do.
I'm sorry, I had to step out for a moment, so you may have said this. If you don't own a free motion foot, can you hand stitch?
I wouldn't hand stitch. You would just then put it under the machine with your regular presser foot and follow this around with a very short stitch.
Okay.
Now, does your machine, can you drop the feed on your machine?
I don't think so. Mine is a $99 special 20 years ago.
Oh, okay. You know, something at some point, you know, think about it, because free motion stitching in, you know, it saves my bacon in a lot of situations. But other than
Okay.
that, you could just, you know, you dial it down to the shortest stitch you can and just sew around that like you normally would.
Okay.
Okay. And work all the way around rather
Kenneth?
than trying to start Yes.
Um,
at one of the ends.
Hi, I'm just asking on top of the question she just asked.
Yes.
Does dropping the feed dogs, what does that do if you're using a regular foot?
Well, I've never tried it with a regular foot because I think there's a little bit too much pressure on, you know, the foot pressing down against the bed of the machine. You could give that a try though. There is also a device called a spring needle. And it's for those days before we had darning feet on machines. It's a needle that has a spring on the shaft, and the spring on the shaft functions like a darning foot. So you could take the presser foot off your machine and put this spring needle on, and it will do pretty much the same thing.
Oh, with the feed dogs lowered at the same
Yes,
time?
that's correct.
Oh,
Yes.
okay.
Yeah, the spring needle is one of those things a lot of people don't know about, but you know, if you're working with a machine that doesn't have a darning foot, it's a good workaround.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
This is probably obvious, but you flipped it facing back out before you did this, right?
What was that again?
So are you stitching through, you're not stitching through the front of your buttonhole, right? You're just
No,
stitching.
no, this is just through the facing.
So you've opened the facing back out.
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's finish this buttonhole. From here, we'll go to the pressing table. Our first step here is to press. And from here, we want to open this up. Flip it to the stitches. And one little clip there, and one here. And like I said, you could make this a rectangle the shape of the welt if you wished. That would make it appear to be double-sided. But if you plan on keeping the jacket closed, this works just fine. Okay, so we have it open, we have it clipped. The next step is turning the organza to the inside. You see where this is going? If you color match the organza, you'll never see it. And finally, you press. And when you press, ideally you want to pull it so that the face fabric favors in slightly.
So hard. Yeah. What time is it? 6 minutes.
Oh, okay. was gonna go to Staples.
Oh, I'm gonna go with you.
You wanna come?
Yeah, I like to, would you mind stopping at some plant stores?
Yeah, sure.
Go tell your father that Hallie Woodcock died.
And stitch it closed
Uh-huh.
to
Go
finish.
ahead.
So I will do that off camera.
Could you
Yeah.
repeat that,
Bring it
Kenneth?
back to the work table to show. Hello, do I need to rerun that?
Somebody was talking and I couldn't hear what you said.
Okay, so let me just back it up a little bit. Sure. Yeah, so if you're not speaking, please mute your mic so that everyone can hear. Keeping the jacket closed. Okay, there we are. And finally, where this is going, turning the organza, there we go, to the inside. You see where this is going? If you color match the organza, you'll never see it. And finally, you press. And when you press, ideally you want to pull it so that the face fabric favors in slightly. And finally, where this is going, you can bring this on top and hand stitch it closed to finish. So I will do that off camera and bring it back to the work table to show you the result. You can see I'm sewing this with a tiny little slip stitch. And I'm catching the wool itself, not the organza, because you want the organza to roll into the inside. And then catch some at the end here. Okay, we are almost done. So let me secure this. And I'll trim the thread. And we will revel in the beauty of this buttonhole. That is what it looks like on the inside. That is what it looks like on the outside, ready to accept a button. And there we have it. We have a double welt pocket. And we have a bound buttonhole. The inside finished. Ta-da! Okay then, so
Okay.
questions?
I do.
Yes, Martha.
You recommend that we do a few practice ones before we.
Absolutely. You see, this is one of those things that I tell my students all the time, because I do this. Like if I'm working with the fabric that I have, that I've not worked with before, absolutely. You do a few test runs, because there are certain things that you can kind of adjust a little bit, like the distance from the stitching line from the center of the edge. If it's a little thicker fabric, you know that, okay, I need to take that a little closer to the center rather than closer to the edge. Yeah, it's always a good idea to make some samples before you start. Absolutely.
And I think my coat probably only needs one button.
Or you could do worked buttonholes. That's what I ended up doing on this coat, is because we have a place in New York called Jonathan's Embroidery that, you just take it there, and for $1 a buttonhole, it come out perfect. So why would I go through the nosebleed of doing them myself?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so other questions? Yes,
With the
Lori.
napped fabric for the welt units, you're gonna get one welt with the nap going the right way and one going the wrong way,
No,
right?
actually, no, it should all face the same way. You would
Okay.
have to be, yeah, because if you think about it, the nap is all headed in one direction. So that if you cut them in and put them together, it should still, the nap should all still read the same direction.
Okay, you just have to be careful when you put it on that you put it on not backwards.
That's correct, yes.
And if it's backwards, it's a buttonhole, so nobody will really know anyway.
Yeah, just use large buttons.
Yeah, I should have showed you what I'm getting, but anyway.
Okay, so who else? Yes, Renee.
So if you're doing multiples, would you do all of the bound part first and then go back and do all of the
Yeah,
face?
so what I like to do is I'll make a long strip of the welt unit. Then you can cut it into sections. And so I will sew all of the welt units on the garment first, get all that stitching done. Then when I open them in and finish them individually. So, after you have everything sewn down, after you've cut up the center, so you have two pieces instead of one, then each button, I will cut it open, turn it, press it, sew the ends, get one buttonhole done, and then go on to the next one. I find that works the best. Because if you start cutting all those openings, things could get kind of skewed. Okay.
So before you whip stitch one to the line or to the facing.
Okay, well, because when you're, well, actually, what you can do is you can mark, pin the organza, get all the marking, get all the stitching done, and then you can open those up and turn the organza in on all of them, and then you can sew all of them. But when you're installing the welt units at the beginning, I like to make a big bunch of the welt unit and then sew everything down and cut the pieces, cut the two halves apart, and then cut the buttonholes open and finish. But the backside on the facing, you can kind of do all those steps at once. Okay. Yeah. So Lori.
So my buttons are 1.25 inches because that's all I could get.
Okay. So what you could do is make a longer buttonhole.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What I was going to ask you is, so I have to extend the center.
I would a little bit. Otherwise, it's going to look like they're sitting a little too close to the edge.
And which do I extend the edge of the buttonhole goes that direction as well, right?
Okay. The typical buttonhole placement is you have the center front, and when you're marking a buttonhole, the buttonhole will extend 1/8 of an inch out past the center front towards the finished edge.
Okay.
And what that little extra 1/8 of an inch is that, it accommodates for the shank of the button, for making the buttonhole, so that when the button actually, when the button and buttonhole, when you button everything up, the two center fronts will align, in fact.
So when I extend the length of the buttonhole, I extend it towards the armhole.
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah. Okay.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay. So other questions? Yes, Linda.
Yes, just to make sure of the working order, we are doing the bound buttonholes after we mark. Pardon?
If you choose to, you could use a regular worked buttonhole. Yes, you want to get all your marking done first. That's why I showed that initially. Then the next step would be, this is when you would, if you're decided on using bound buttonholes, this is when you would add the bound buttonholes at this step.
Just in the front piece. The next step is not doing the lining and all.
Man, that's further down the road. When we put the facing on, then you'll finish the backs of the buttonholes.
Okay, that's what I thought. I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah. Okay. So other questions?
Yes, if
I'm a bit confused. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, let Jennifer first, and then yeah, go ahead, Jennifer.
Thank you, Kenneth. I apologize. So if I'm going to do, I think I may just do the regular stitch buttonholes to start with.
Right.
Just
Mm-hmm.
am I going through the facing and the front when I'm?
Yeah, if you're using a regular worked buttonhole, that generally occurs towards the end, and yes, it goes through the facing and the front of the fabric.
So technically I can skip this step.
Absolutely.
Yes. Okay. Perfect.
This is just for those people who would like to bound buttonhole. So Vivian, did you?
Yes, please. So I'm going to attempt a bound buttonhole since I'm in the course. Why not? So to make sure I understand, so I've cut out my pieces. I have my 2 front pieces. I have my 2 front facings.
Okay, so facings, so what you would do is set the facings aside for now.
Yes, and I'll work on my bound buttonhole on the front, on the outside front.
Yeah.
But I need to attach the facing for that side that has the band.
No, ma'am.
To do the.
No, not just yet. See, this is where, you put the bound buttonholes in.
Yeah.
The whip close. So further down the road, when we put in the facing, and that's going to be further down the road, when the facing is completely installed,
Then you do the facing buttonhole.
Then you would finish the backside of the buttonholes onto the facing.
Oh, okay, so we just saw something that will be further down the line. We saw what to do now, plus what's happening further down the line.
That's correct. Yes, ma'am.
Bingo. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so now someone else had a question?
Yes,
That
I
was
have
me,
a question.
but actually she's just answered it, so it's fine.
Oh, okay. So yeah. So Cookie, what's your question?
Okay, my question is, could we do the bound buttonhole in the back, with the facing all at the end? Do we have to put the bound buttonholes on first?
That's correct. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so we couldn't wait to do both steps at the same time at the end?
No, that's my students at FIT try that, and you could, but it's a damn nosebleed. Why would you wait? It's just like making your life easier, having the front section flat, and you don't have to wrestle with the sleeves and everything else.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, see, I'm all about easier. I want it as easy as possible. So it is far easier to install them right at the beginning.
Okay.
Okay, so who else had a question? Yes, Lori.
Silly question, but just to reinforce it in my brain.
Okay.
What side for women do you put the buttonholes and
women are always right. My mother used to say it. That's how I remember it. The women are always right.
So the buttonholes go on the right side for women.
That's correct. Right over left.
Okay.
And it's Vivian again. What is, as a general rule?
Yes.
What is the gap in buttons for a coat?
That's sort of it depends. How I determine button placement is I like to have a button right at the fullest part of the bust. And then I decide, okay, if there's another button above that, how far up is that? And that is really to taste and depending on the design. That then is your button spacing.
Gotcha.
There's no numbers as a rule that I know of. I know that I like to have a button and buttonhole at the fullest part of the bust, otherwise you get a gap. And then, I look at the button above that where that's going to be, and then that determines the placement below as well.
But if there's a lapel, you have to find the end of the roll point, right? And that'll be your first one.
That's correct, yes.
And then, so then you don't have that reference.
No, but then you see, that's another one of those things you would just do by eye.
Okay.
You would decide, is this a 1 button? Is this a 2 button? Is this a 3 button? And so, you would just cut out little cardboard circles on your muslin and do some double stick tape on the back and move them around to see what looks
I
best.
see. Okay, thank you. Okay.
Okay, so other questions? Okay, so your homework is, cutting out, marking. If you would like to try some buttonholes, bound buttonholes, I would say knock yourself out. They're a lot of fun to do, actually. And so next week I'm gonna be pushing the cuff latch to next week, but so next week we're gonna start a little more construction. And so if you've not had the office hour, don't be shy about saying, when can we schedule an office hour? I would say not on Monday, because I'm having a tooth out on Monday. So I'll be probably drugged all day Monday, because I said to this is happening a little sooner than I thought. I was expecting it May 15th, but the guy called and said, hey, I have a spot on Monday. We need to get that tooth out. You want to do it? I'm like, okay. And so I said to him, Valium. He said, oh, we'll have laughing gas. No, Valium. So I'm going to be a little bit kind of goofy on Monday. So that would probably not be a day to schedule an office hour. So we good? Okay, folks. So what I'd say is enjoy the rest of your weekend. And if you have questions, you can email me as well. I have no quarrel with doing that. That's, you know, if it makes your life easier, then absolutely. So with that, I will wrap everything up. Later on today, or maybe tomorrow, I'll send you the recording of the Zoom meeting, and then I'll also send you the links on YouTube for the 2 videos that we got to see within the lesson today. So you have both of those. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Very good.
Monday.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend.
Okay. You
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye now. You know, it's just, oh, there we are. So Richard, are you still there? Okay, Richard, I'm going to assume you're not there. And oh, yes. Oh, okay. Take care. If you have questions, let me know.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye now.